Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. We have people coming from different parts of the world. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to this conversation on climate change and how we can involve women and girls to fix the climate crisis. My name is Jasmine Huggins. I work at Churchville Service, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today. The webinar is 90 minutes long. We will use an interview format, and our speakers will use slides to illustrate their points. We will then have some time for questions and answers and for discussion where you can put your questions directly to the speakers. And then we will briefly summarize the points that have been raised. First, some housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded. We have actually started recording already. We welcome you to turn your cameras on so we can see who is in the room, but we ask you to keep your microphones muted throughout the session until we come to questions and answers at the end. For the question and answer part of our conversation, if you have any questions, please type them into the Zoom chat by using the chat function and identify if you're putting the question to Mary, Rostam, or Andrew. First, a little bit about Churchville Service. CWS Global is a 70-year-old faith-based organization transforming communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. Our organization works in about 30 countries, including the United States. CWS understands that the climate emergency is both local and global. Its impacts have disproportionately affected some groups, notably those whose power to influence policy or decision-making is comparatively weaker to that of others. Impoverished, vulnerable, at-risk, or disempowered communities who are disempowered because of their gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. CWS has been around for about 70 years, for more than 70 years. And from our experience, there are 3 issues that we would like to use to frame this conversation. The first, the United States of America historically is the world's largest historic emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases. It has only 25% of the population, but the highest per capita emissions in the world. That means per person. More people emit greenhouse gas emissions in the United States than anywhere else in the world. The second thing, at the other end of the scale, millions of people don't have their basic energy needs met. So ensuring affordable, accessible, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy sources is goal number 7 out of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Today, some 789 million people still lack electricity. In some of the world's poorest countries, 1 in 4 health facilities are not electrified. Today, only 17% of our total energy comes from renewable sources, despite the fact that in many developing countries, there is often an abundant supply of natural resources that can be exploited, for example, sun or wind. In addition, 3 billion people live without access to clean and safe cooking facilities. They either go without energy completely, or they must make tremendous sacrifices to find that energy. This places additional burdens on the poorest, particularly women and girls, who must go far in search of wood for fuel or water for cooking and washing. The third issue we want to use to frame this conversation, despite this situation that I've just described, governments, donors, and agencies still do not put these vulnerable and at-risk communities at the heart of their policies and programs. Although finances now give more funds to build alternative renewable energy projects, only 12% of that funding goes to the world's least developed countries. The world's poorest countries and communities don't have the level of support and resourcing they need to adapt to climate change, recover from its impacts, or to transition to a low carbon development model. These countries need help to build alternative energy systems. The speakers here today are all deeply concerned about this situation and about how it will impact their communities. We are very fortunate to have three experts who will help us to explore these issues further. I will now introduce them. Mary Obiero is the Director of Relief Development and Protection at Church World Service Africa. She is an expert in community organization and engagement. She is a multi-skilled professional with 20 years experience in program design, integrated programs in different thematic sectors, including water, sanitation and hygiene, or WASH as it's commonly called, food security, community livelihoods, education, youth empowerment, emergency response, and disaster risk management with gender sensitivity lenses in Africa. Prior to this, Mary worked as Senior Regional Program Coordinator at CWS Africa, where she oversaw the Water for Life program. And before joining CWS Africa, Mary worked with the Danish Volunteer Services, with Moi University in Kenya, and the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development. Mary has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology from Kenyatta University. Welcome, Mary. Rostam Gamisonia is an agroeconomist from Georgia. He has been the director of NGO Rural Communities Agency in his native country since 2001. His doctorate from the Agrarian University of St. Petersburg is in agrobusiness. Over 20 years, he has authored multiple works on poverty eradication, food security, agriculture, rural tourism, agricultural investment, income generation, and women in agriculture. His organization addresses root causes and impact of climate change, including clean water technology, sustainable sanitation and recycling of biomass, non-timber forest products, the use of solar and biomass energy in the development of eco-sustainable livelihoods for rural communities. His professional career has included membership of multiple professional bodies, including the World Bank, the Georgian Mountain Federation, the Scientific Council of Academy of Agrarian Sciences, the Board of Women in Europe for Common Future, and the Climate Change Alliance. He has worked for the Georgian government, for the UN bodies like the UNHCR, FAO, World Bank Group, and also beyond Georgia, in Europe and Central Asia, in countries including Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and elsewhere. Welcome, Rostam. We are so pleased to have you with us. And our very own Andrew Fuse for CWS is the Senior Director for Global Migration in our New York office. Andrew serves, he has worked with CWS for 12 years, responding to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. He has been the Associate Director for Immigration and Refugee Programs, and also has served as Interim Regional Coordinator for CWS Africa. He has worked with CWS teams and partners in more than a dozen countries to design humanitarian response and development activities, evaluate program results, and is now undertaking research on migration and displacement. Currently, that work includes research in 5 countries: Cambodia, Georgia, Haiti, Indonesia, and Kenya, and it's working to document local perceptions of climate change and the links between climate and migration. Before joining CWS, Andrew served as policy officer with the International Land Coalition and as program officer with the Asia division of the National Democratic Institute. He has a master's degree in public policy from the University of California. Andrew is my partner in crime on all things climate. Welcome, Andrew. I am thrilled to have such an experienced and professional staff working with us on this conversation today. So I want to put everything in context for people who may be calling in with different levels of understanding about climate change and how it is affecting different people in different places. Starting with you, Mary. Mary, can you say how climate change is affecting your community?
Thank you so much, Jasmine, and I'm privileged to be on this panel to discuss how climate change affects women and girls and generally communities in my region. I'll start by saying that climate change in Africa and in Kenya in particular, when there is drought and when the riverbeds have dried and there's no firewood, it's the woman who walks 10 miles one trip to bring home just 4 gallons of dirty water. It's the woman who spends 8 hours searching for water, and it's the woman who will spend 8 hours to search for firewood. And in this case, as the mothers do that, they either tag along their daughters to support them, or they leave their girls behind to undertake house chores. So that means that the effect on climate change is not just on women, but it's on the girls. And it is increasing the poverty levels and making it some families to remain in the poverty cycle, just year in, year out. So I would start by saying that increasing temperatures and sea levels are changing the rainfall patterns in Africa. We have more extreme weather at the moment, which are threatening to health and food security. Water scarcity is becoming a really big challenge, and the socio-economic development in Africa is becoming limited in one way or another. Women and girls are affected, and they are affected more severely by climate change and its impacts, as the climate change impacts on biodiversity and natural resources. I just said in my opening statement that when we have, the women depend highly on biomass. And when this biomass reduces, then we have a problem with accessing firewood, accessing food, and getting natural resources. And also in this part of the world, most households in the rural areas still depend on natural water sources, which are not household-based, but they are community-based. You'll get one water source being used by almost 300, 500 households. Many times I challenge myself and I tell people that we talk about water availability. And in the developed world, like in the US, you'll have maybe 10 taps in your house or 5 taps in your house. But in Africa, we still have 1 tap being shared by 1,000 people. In the face of climate change, the ability of women to obtain these resources has really reduced. And as I said earlier, this is actually making them to decline economic development really to decline. And this generally affects their welfare. And it also cripples their access to security, because as they walk 10 miles to go and fetch water, along the way, they get into issues of gender-based violence, and they're also even attacked by wild animals. This reduces women's resilience, and it actually puts them down in the situation where they do not have freedom of making choices and taking informed actions. So looking at it, I would again say that in Kenya, we are a country of about 50 million people, and 80% of our country is arid or semi-arid. That means that it receives very limited rain. It has very high temperatures. And for that reason, there are two issues, in the sense that most people who stay in these areas lack in everything. They lack in water, they have not accessed school. And as we are speaking, at the moment, we only have 50% of Kenyan women who have been able to complete secondary school. So given that, and given that the communities are really struggling in Kenya, it is really the issue of gender-based violence is getting up, as we look into it like a household that is headed by a woman lacks more in getting resources and also even making decisions. Women who are divorced, separated, or widows have really challenges in accessing resources to be able to take care of their families. So women and girls are really affected in this particular point, in the sense that like during this time when we have had drought in the country, we had locust infection in the country due to actually effects of climate change. We have times when more girls are actually drop out of school, or they're taken out of school for being, they can be taken out of schools to go and be married off early, because the families look at dowry as a way of being able to access some resources as a mitigation and adaptation strategy towards climate change. And in this case also, women, given that they are also lacking in the resources, they cannot be able to fight better for their girls. On the other hand, men are a bit privileged. Like we talk about this being information age, where we have mobile phones all over. In the communities where we work, we find that men have access to information, even on whether they're informed about when it's likely to rain, because they have mobile phones, and that enables them to make informed decisions when they are planning, as compared to women, and especially women who are leading their own homes or their own houses. They may not have they may not have access to this information. So I would say in Africa, again, we have only 15% of women who have access to land. When I say they have access to land, most of women in Africa actually have access to land, but they do not own it. It's owned by men. And in most cases, actually, the man will dictate what should be done by land. And in some situations, even after you have done your farming and you have harvested, the man will determine where the money that comes from the farm produce goes. And for this reason, with now increasing climate change related issues, then women are left in more situations where they are not able to even now be able to rent land and do like their own personal farming. So basically, looking at it from that point, women are trying to work in groups to be able to deal with these issues. And it's very unfortunate that most of them do not have really, they are not sitting on the tables where we are sitting to make decisions that affect, to voice their voices first of all, and to be involved in decision making. As it goes, women are also not into strong leadership positions in this region. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. That's an excellent introduction to quite a complex scenario. Rostam, I want to turn to you now. Georgia is not a country that we hear very much about. So please, could you say, so that we can understand, how is climate change affecting your community and region?
Yes, Georgia is a not relatively, but it's a small country, developing country, located at the juncture of Europe and Asia. And Georgia, as the other countries of South Caucasus and countries of Eastern Europe, already shows climate-induced changes with increasing temperatures, shrinking glaciers, sea level rise, reduction and redistribution of river flows, decreasing snowfall, and upward shift of snowfalls. More extreme weather events have also characterized the last 10 years in Georgia, with flooding, landslides, droughts, heavy storms, hail, forest fires, coastal erosion, land degradation, loss of biodiversity, with significant economic losses and human casualties. Reported damages due to natural disasters, floods, landslides, droughts in Georgia and in the country South Caucasus comprise up to $400 million. Well, for the purpose of generating warmth, including warm water, cooking and heating houses, village population in rural areas mostly use fossil fuels or biomass, dried dung, shrubs, fire firewood, but also all kinds of waste, such as plastic. In average, one household in rural areas of Georgia spend up to 10 cubic meters of firewood. According to the assessment of the Ministry of the Environment, some 3.7 million cubic meters of firewood are consumed annually in Georgia, while the regeneration capacity of Georgian forests comprises 1.2 million cubic meters. As a result of using this big amount of biomass and firewood, we have forest destruction, deforestation, landslides, floods, avalanches of catastrophic character that have become frequent phenomena. And it has a very severe impact on the environment and causes big emissions of carbon dioxide. As you are well aware, 1 ton of biomass emits some 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing considerably to deforestation and thus to land degradation, which in turn has adverse effects on quality of life, food security, and incomes of women and girls, and the impacts of energy poverty are really very sensitive in Georgia. As a result of energy poverty is not about not having access to the energy, it's here more about how much we spend to meet our energy needs. And most of the women do not meet their energy needs in rural population. Rural population in Georgia, one household spends some 28% of their income they spend to cover their energy needs. And as a result, this leads to poverty. But also, as I said, the illegal and uncontrolled use of firewood leads to deforestation that in turn leads to land erosion, land degradation, loss of biodiversity, and food insecurity, and therefore less incomes of the population, thus leading us to poverty. On the other hand, as a loss of forest, we have, and use of conventional fuel, we have emissions of carbon dioxide that is carbon dioxide that is and contributes to global warming. As a result of this climate change, as I mentioned before, we have natural disasters, and what is more important, we have acute problems in supplying of the rural population, and particularly women and girls, with safe drinking water and safe sanitation. And this also leads us to poverty, and the result of poverty, people are migrating. And due to the poverty and all the calamities and disasters, there is a gender-based violence is prevailing in many rural areas of the country. The situation with water supply, the women and girls, as you know, are main providers of household water supply and sanitation, and have the primary responsibility for maintaining a clean home environment. The lack of access to safe water and sanitation facilities affects women and girls most actively. In rural areas of Georgia, most of the population, up to 60%, do not have access to safe sanitation, and some 70% of people do not have access to safe drinking water. The people in rural areas still use pit latrines that pollute the environment, river bodies, drinking water, that affects the health and is the cause of water-related diseases. And also, I should say that the social, economic, and technological background of the rural areas of the country are very much at the grassroots level. Poor sanitation, lack of reliable supply of safe water has serious consequences for children and mothers, and they are medically, socially, culturally, and physically vulnerable. On the other hand, inefficient cooking and water warming systems, inefficient stoves cause number of diseases, as women and girls are mostly exposed to hazardous particles emitted by inefficient stoves, and number of reported cases from use of inefficient devices comes up to 2,000. So I should say that number of deaths, sorry. But though I should say here we don't have a very good monitoring criteria for this crisis. And we should say in the summary that women in rural areas remain at the margin of development, and they experience energy poverty, access to water, access to inputs, access to they have lack of access to sanitation, safe drinking water, lack of access to financial and other productive resources to live in decently and sustain the livelihoods. And I also want to say that when women experience energy poverty and water scarcity, and the consequences for them are really very severe. As a result of time-consuming and physically draining collection of biomass or fetching water from far distances, conditions, bad health of women, and they have no incomes for doing this unpaid work. According to the estimations, women spend 10 times more than men on unpaid work in Georgia and the countries of South Caucasus. So then this makes them more vulnerable, and they are also subject of violence. Thanks. This is what I wanted to say, just.
Thank you, Rostam. You're speaking about a very different geographical region with a completely different history, but yet the story seems to be quite similar. Thank you for that. Andrew, I want to come now to you. We've heard from rural Kenya and from rural Georgia and the Caucasus, and we've heard about women not being at the center of the development process, energy poverty, land ownership, vulnerability to violence. Are these some of the issues that you are encountering in your research as you look at the climate and migration link?
Thanks, Jasmine. A great question. You can hear me all right, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, I think CWS has been working with our local partners in 5 countries, including with RCDA in Georgia, to understand better what are the relationships between climate change and not only migration and displacement, but also on decision-making and risk management with adapting in place. I think we've been hearing and feeling anecdotally that migration and mobility is a fact of life in most of the places where we work, and for many of the families who participate in our programs. And sometimes migration into or through very, very difficult and sometimes threatening channels, but also that people are facing increasing risks at home, especially in relation to climate and climate hazards. Where we work in agricultural communities, most often we hear the impacts in terms of how people are feeling them in their ability to farm and to earn an income from the land. to feed themselves and their family. Also hearing about impacts on health, particularly where water, access to water is growing more challenging and more difficult. Mary was sharing some excellent examples of that from Kenya. And I think hearing that people are looking to invest in adaptation, looking for support to adapt existing agricultural practices, to expand their ability to earn income from other sources beyond agriculture, while also weighing decisions and opportunities to earn income in other places. And in some contexts, that's within countries, movement from rural areas to towns and cities, and in some cases it's across borders. In terms of the sort of applying a gender lens and thinking about women and girls in this with these questions, one thing that I've been noting from some of the interview responses, we've been doing interviews in each of the 5 countries and are just now starting focus groups. Mary mentioned before the challenge of women in accessing information, including information about weather forecasts, seasonal weather forecasts. Even before that, I think there's a lack of visibility to women's roles in farming, in rural production, agricultural production. And so that creates sort of a double obstacle, double barrier for women to be able to access the kinds of information or other technical supports, agricultural extension that would be needed to adjust farming techniques in a context where climate is having a real impact. So I think there's probably a need not only to have a connection to the technology, but also just generally for there to be more visibility to the roles women are already playing in agricultural economies, whether at the family level or at the level of communities or even whole countries.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really helpful. That's really helpful background. I want to come back to this picture that you've all painted of lack of access to energy, electricity, to water. How does that work during a pandemic? How do people access health services at a critical time where we know that just access, the ability to wash your hands can save a life, that can save somebody else's life, the ability to just be clean, to maintain a certain level of sanitation. Mary, starting with you, can you say a little bit about what have been the challenges for you and your communities during this COVID-19 pandemic, given the lack of electricity and water where you are?
That's a very important question, and I wish we would be asked to direct women in Kenya, in West Pokot, in areas where they walk 10 miles to bring home 4 gallons of that water. Actually, if you ask that question, they'll tell you that they have no answer, because they'll not be able to wash their hands when they don't have water to cook the food. That has really been challenging in a way that in these communities that we talk about, that I'm talking about today, they are not following those protocols because they do not have water. And this is occupying about 80% of the Kenya population. I want to say that maybe God is faithful in the way that these places are scarcely populated. Hello?
Can you repeat what you just said in the last 2 minutes, because the internet was coming in and out? Can you just repeat?
Okay, I was saying that your question is very important, and I wish we could ask it to a woman in West Pokot, where they walk 10 miles to bring home 4 gallons of water. The answer would be no, that they are not washing their hands. And I think God has been faithful to these communities in a way that COVID-19 cases have not been very high in these locations because of the sparsely populated. These are areas that have fewer people. So we keep on praying that COVID-19 do not really get down there, because the problem will be really huge. In relation to this particular women accessing health centers, I think it has been really a challenge with the restriction in movement. And there's a very huge cry about not just accessing health, but reproductive health. Even for women who are trying to plan their families, they have found themselves on the wrong side because they have not been able to access the health services. So basically, with the COVID-19 pandemic, these communities are even more disadvantaged. And the worst that has happened in these communities, I think girls have been more affected during the restrictions, the lockdowns, and schools in Kenya closed for 7 months. And with the schools closing for 7 months, we have had about 10% of girls not coming back to school. They are either pregnant or they have been married off early due to economic hardships within their families.
And when you say married off early, what age are you talking about, Mary?
I'm talking about age 13, age 15. These are kids who are in grade 8 and grade 9. So they get married off so that the bride price can be paid and the family is actually using that as a relief during this COVID-19 situation.
Right. Thanks for that, Mary. Ross, I'm coming over to you. How do families prevent the transmission of COVID-19 without water and electricity?
Yes, really. Pandemic was really a great challenge for all the communities everywhere in the world, but in the communities where they lack access to drinking water and water for irrigation, the problem has become more acute. And we, in some cases, had big difficulties to convince these people to keep silent, or not silent, not silent, but to keep themselves and restrain themselves from moving. But they had to move for water for 2 or 3 kilometers in some remote communities. And those who were left without energy, they were complaining that they had some health problems, and mostly the psychological problems with children that do not having access to internet, to electricity, to TV. It was very difficult to keep the children, so to say, quiet and follow the rules and regulations of pandemic. While, you see, I want to mention it here that most of the rural communities are supplied by water, by drinking water through springs, water and mountain springs. And the situation is really dramatic when there is no one responsible for maintenance of these springs. Centralized systems are under the supervision of the government, but small-scale water supply systems are under the community supervision, but the communities lack skills and capacities to maintain the headworks, to repair the pipes and the leakages, and draining some waste into the drinking water pipes also has become a problem during this pandemic, because you couldn't access many areas because of restrictions of movement and lockdowns. And this situation really was on the merge of, so to say, rebel. Do I say it properly or not? I don't know, but people really were dissatisfied. But here in the areas of our project, we could, as or so in the areas, to manage together with the local administration, local people, that for the time being, due to pandemic, it's that they should take the responsibility for their water supply and for their energy supply. And this could be done in a decentralized way. So we need, particularly during these pandemics, decentralized production of food and energy that really makes easier to sustain the livelihood. And this decentralized policy should be supported by the governments, by the municipalities, by the international organizations and donors that in some cases do not pay much attention to decentralized production of food and fuel. So it has nothing against the globalization. Through decentralization, we can achieve better globalization and better success in sustaining the livelihood of these people. So they are all intermeshed, but I would like to say that the issues of water and pandemic, not only pandemic, it's a disaster. Water and natural disasters, energy and natural disasters, these things should be more in-depth surveys and studies are needed country by country and even by communities that we were trying to do in our Church World Service supported projects.
Thank you, Rostam. You've raised a number of very, very important issues about what donors fund and what they don't fund, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes. But for now, Andrew, I want to come back to you with the same question about, what your research has showed up about how the pandemic has made life even more difficult for at-risk groups. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think since early on in the pandemic, migrants associations and civil society groups that are accompanying people on the move were raising the flag concerns about access to essential services. For CWS, we are supporting in central Mexico one local partner that manages a faith-based shelter, and they've been telling us they're one of the few shelters in their network of maybe 20 plus across Mexico that's been able to remain open throughout the whole pandemic, and that even just accessing safety, accessing places where you could get PPE and have a place to wash your hands and get a night's sleep has become tighter. And there's also been a significant increase in xenophobia that had already existed, but became, I think, in many places more acute and even more politicized since the pandemic began. For those of you on the line from the US, we've lived through that in our own country, unfortunately. And also, unfortunately, the US, it's not unique to the US. There are incidents of xenophobia on the rise in many countries throughout the world, with migrants and refugees being scapegoated during the pandemic. And I think that's also that's also increasing the difficulty for people who are already on the move to access essential services. The pandemic's also really, particularly where there have been lockdowns put in place 1, 2, 3, 4 times now, has really impacted the informal economy, and for many migrants and asylum seekers, that's where people are able to earn an income and be able to do what they can to feed themselves, feed their families if they have their families with them. In places where CWS has been doing our community research, when we first thought of this, of doing this systemic learning around climate and migration, it was before the pandemic that we started to think of the idea. We weren't expecting to have as many touch points with people who had migrated and then returned. And we're I think able now to hear stories from people who were able to move, partly in relation to climate, often in relation to other factors, and use that as a way of earning an income, being able to expand economic opportunities, other opportunities for their families back home. We're now also hearing that those opportunities aren't necessarily there today in April 2021, the way they might have been 15, 16 months ago. So as we think forward about what kind of recovery is going to be in place, how that recovery can reflect principles of justice, principles of sustainability, I think we'll have to also pay attention to not only where people are looking to invest in resilience in place, which certainly many people are doing, but also where migration is being considered as an option, often for temporary purposes, for moving for specific work purposes with the intention of returning home. Do those channels still exist? Can people still access them safely if people are moving, even within their own country, what's the social environment? Are you going to face heightened threats or animosity that you may not have faced even to quite the same extreme level a year and a half ago?
Thanks for that, Andrew. We have painted a quite a bleak picture, partly because of pre-existing and structured patterns of behavior, traditions, norms, gender conditioning, which have, in the context of poverty and inequality, made the lives of women and girls particularly difficult. And that has been exacerbated, as we know, by the pandemic. But we know also that there is another side to the story, and that is when targeted interventions are supported at the community level, that things can change. And so we want to turn now to the other side of the coin. And, you know, let's hear some examples of how change has happened or can happen when the right interventions are supported, either by organizations such as ourselves, such as CWS, or by larger amounts of funding from governments, maybe bilateral or multilateral. So Mary, I want to start with you because I know you've done a lot of work in this area. We know that people are not just victims, girls and women are agents of change, and that change can be very meaningful at domestic, community, even national level. Can you say a little bit about how your work has been transformational in this area?
CWS in Africa uses multiple approaches to build women capacity to undertake actions that challenge gendered structured that contribute girls and women disempowerment. So we use water as an entry point because we realize that if you go to work with a community that is water stressed, even if you build schools, you will not find children in those schools. If you train women to do small business, they will not attend the business. And for that reason, we use water as an entry point so that we are able to reduce the time women are spending to look for water from 8 hours to maybe 30 minutes. We reduce the distance that they are walking from 10 miles to maybe a half a mile or 1 mile. At that particular point, you have actually solved so many problems. You have solved women healthy issues. You have given women lots of time. And during our programming, we do a lot of community training and women engagement, in the sense that within our water management committee, we insist that 50% of the managers here uses water as an entry point to community development. And we train women within our water management committee to be managers for these water resources. With this water management and with the building training women, we have been able to create a women-led social capital that strengthens the human resource and institutional at community level. And women are actually in full charge of the water management. We have extended this to education, in the sense that we have built a number of schools in these communities to encourage girls to attend schools. But in the real sense, we want women also to be on the school boards to manage these schools. This has gone a long way in making sure that women do not just become managers of the school, but they are able to push their daughters to school and maintain them in school. For them to be able to do this, we have established what we call livelihood programming, where we are training women in small business management. We are doing a lot of financial literacy, and we are helping women to pull their resources together in form of small money, like someone coming for a meeting with $50 and continuously doing that for 1 month, for 2 months, and down into 6 months. If it's a group of 30 women, they'll be having like $500 or $100, and they're able to distribute this money amongst themselves. They go to start small businesses at home, and they are able to support their daughters by paying school levies and buying school stationery to maintain the girls in school. We have also come up with activities that are generally women sensitive or gender sensitive, in a way that Like beekeeping in some of these communities, it was considered to be a man activity. But we came up with the modern beekeeping methodologies that actually encouraged women to participate. In the African setting, the bees are kept on top of a tree, and it was very difficult for a woman to climb a tree to harvest honey. But we have developed a beehive that can be pulled down from a tree using strings. And a woman does not really need to come and climb a tree and be able to get down the bee. We did this because of climate change related issues in these communities. Women have come out, people have come out strongly to say beekeeping is one of those activities that they can rely on, come drought, come floods. If the beehives are hanged on the trees, whether there is drought or there's floods, they'll actually come back and be able to harvest their honey, sell the honey, and proceed on with life. So we have tried to include women in men-dominated activities. And we have really tried to make women to be in position to make decisions. We have seen this go a long way, apart from women just supporting their daughters in school. We have seen this go a long way in women becoming leaders in these communities. And at that particular point, we are looking at it like we have women now who are sitting on community leadership structures, not even at just a community level, but at a higher level. And that is pushing. They are starting now to talk about how they can be more involved in decision making, even at county level. They are lobbying their local governments to come up with the programs that will support girls in school. And for this reason, in the schools which CWS has developed, we have put up boarding facilities where girls can actually live in school. And when they live in school, they have more time for work, schoolwork, but also they are safe from the men who want to marry them or their fathers who want to sell them off. And we have seen women go out and lobby the local governments to equip these facilities, provide like water, provide bedding facilities so that the girls can be comfortable in this school. We have worked in these communities over 10 years, and we are seeing now the girls we supported when we started working in 2007 are coming back to these communities as primary school teachers. And for us, that's the greatest achievement, because now these communities are not hearing from me as a director for program for CWS, but they're hearing from their own girls who have gone through the process, the importance of maintaining girls in school and the importance of women being in leadership. So we wish to scale up these activities. Funding, if it's available, we could want to do more of this and in more communities, not just in Kenya, but across the East Africa region.
Thank you, Mary, for giving us such a powerful and inspiring example of how things can change when you work consistently over time and when you start small and then think big. Wonderful story. Rostam, in your work in Georgia, you've devoted a lot of your personal and professional time to also working with women and building their capacities. Can you give us some examples of how that has worked in your area?
In our activities within the frame of George World Service supported and other projects, we make major focus on building local capacities, building skills and capacities, and building human capital that can really pursue the goals of sustainable development. And in all our projects, we are just have a quite set clear criteria for projects that 50% of our projects are gender, not 50%, but 50% of project participants are women. And that is the rule that we are following and it plays. And I also should say that women are more open for innovations because they are mostly concerned with water. Let's say solar water heaters are very popular. So we have built a group of women ambassadors to replicate these technologies. And women are taking leadership in energy cooperatives that in some areas supplies the households with fuel-efficient stoves, solar water heaters, solar dryers for fruits and vegetables, and other technological devices. That's why we are trying to pilot innovative, simple, affordable technologies that can increase access really to justice, food, energy, water, and sustainable livelihoods, and to make people stay at their places, not to migrate. Because we have, two reasons of migration to factors. One is poverty, that is derived, as we have already mentioned, from many factors, and other is natural disasters and climate change. But when there are natural disasters and it is impossible to live in the area, you, as a mitigation matter, is a migration. But when there are no natural disasters, there are other technologies and, so to say, programs that we use in our activities. And I want also to stress that women are more open for piloting these technologies. Let's say we introduce number of up to 1,000 fuel efficient stoves were constructed by us within these different projects, and women are the owners, especially those that see that the burden of supplying the warm water, cooking, lies on women. They estimate, they value this, so to say, contribution of the project. Or solar water heaters, they totally change the women's view. They live in dignity, and they build self-confidence of the women when they can keep the house clean environment, keep the children warm. And in the meanwhile, the solar water heaters and fuel efficient stoves decrease their energy spendings by a factor of 50–60% in some cases. And very interesting that in Western Georgia, in one of the communities, women initiated establishing of fuel briquette social enterprise, based on local residues of laurel bay leaves. And they are running this business very well. The other way is, there was a picture. We have developed models of small enterprises for remote areas. And in this small enterprise, supported by the Church World Service, that is equipped with, that uses only solar and biomass energy, no other conventional energy, it accommodates, yes, this model enterprise with a solar heater, solar dryer for fruits and vegetables, solar space heating system. And the women that you showed previous in the picture, in this area, they are collecting primula vera. And in April and May, this group of women can gain incomes equal to 1,000 lari. That is a big jump. If we say that one household's income per year comprises 6,000 Georgian lari, it is something $2,000 annually. These women can gain up to 300–400 in 1 month through drying non-timber forest products. And besides the people and women, 17 women that are employed there, it gives the job over 100 women in the community and beyond. People, we build their skills on sustainable collection and processing, big number of women, and then go to the forest and collect according to the rules of sustainability. And they gain the incomes. So this type of enterprises really changes women's life, changes their leadership roles, while they are economically empowered. They are less subject of violence in their areas. So if we continue with this diagram that I put there, the impact of these projects and the technologies are very important. But again, I should stress that the donor and international organizations don't pay much more attention to technological issues that are directly related with mitigating the climate change, mitigating disasters. And our experience of Georgia within our projects using church water service supported technologies is the Hyundai assembly. It was accepted as a good example to follow up, to mitigate the disasters, to sustain the livelihoods, and really the renewable energy technologies can make a change, and it is possible. And here, the leadership is in women's hands. You know why? Because they are more open and they are more concerned with these issues of water scarcity, energy scarcity, lack of input, lack of finance than men. So the role of women in water and sanitation, we have implemented within our projects urine diverted dry toilets. It's a very simple system when you divert urine from feces and you don't pollute the environment. Meanwhile, it is attached with a gray water filter that cleans the water that is coming, gray water or black water coming from the houses or from the devices that you use at your household or wherever. And also supporting women's organized groups is very important for us. That's why in our RED programs, we are supporting women cooperatives. One cooperative that was just opened last year, it's a cooperative that has women group, that has cold storage facility and the drying facility. And it appeared to be of a big success because women had the leading role, not only in managing and maintaining. This enterprise uses only solar energy for running renewable photovoltaics, and solar dryer is installed there. In dryers, they dry, reminder of the food that they don't put into cold storage facility, and they receive double incomes. So it's also a model enterprise that we created that could be replicated not only in Georgia, but in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and any part of the world. And also we pay very big attention we have a lot of research on local resources, conducting LUPA analysis. That means local unrevealed potential assessments within our project that appear extremely helpful to engage local people in planning and decision making. And women play really a leading role in our project, and we can present you, and we had already some stories of women that are successfully sustaining their livelihoods and leading the process of replication of new technologies. This is, in short, what was done within this project. On the diagram, I think it is very clear what are the impacts, and it has a big impact on building resilient, climate just, gender just communities. And this is possible. This is possible if donors and international organizations really will look at them not from the point of highly scientific point of view, but from the point of view of the local indigenous people, indigenous communities, better studying their needs. And I liked very much how Mary had said that they use water as an entry point. You can always use any technologies as an entry point. Let's say for us, an entry point for community water, our school sanitation, water and sanitation plans was the quick test, water quick test that we gave out to the children, and they were testing the quality of their water in their community, and even beyond, going to their relatives, grandfathers or cousins to check the quality of water. And people became aware that there is more, so to say, serious attitude is needed to maintain the water and to gain the water, good water, to receive good quality water. So these are the number of programs and projects that we are implementing. But again, I would just like to say, developing local capacity, skills and capacities, then providing them with technological input, that is knowledge, how to construct, and setting up small businesses. That is within our projects, yes, this is very important. Maybe I am out of time a bit, but I want to mention this. Within our projects, CVS projects, and we were happy to do this, we are training local people, local craftsmen, to make these fuel efficient stoves themselves and sell or give out to the communities. Social enterprise of making solar water heaters, solar dryers for fruits and vegetables, social enterprise on making the briquettes, fuel briquettes from residues. And this is a very important. Then helping them with marketing. And finally, what is very important, with legal and political framework, developing policy recommendations. We are not always heard by the politicians because they consider that gender equality by most of the politicians in all over the world is viewed predominantly as a political issue. For me, gender equality is not a for us, for our programs. It's not a political issue. It's an issue of sustaining our lives and sustaining it for the future generations. And this should be understood by politicians, what we are trying also to do to some extent in our work.
Thank you, Rostam. Excellent, couldn't agree with you more. Gender equality is not a political issue, it's an issue about sustainability. Andrew, from your perspective, what do you think?
One thing we're observing in our community interviews is that people who are moving in relation to climate change are moving through the same sort of migration pathways that people moving for other reasons, whether it's for purely economic reasons, whether it's because of reasons related to persecution or violence. People are moving through the same sort of channels. And for women, especially women from rural areas, sometimes or often this can mean that moving into cities and towns for domestic work is the kind of response that women and even older girls are taking in relation to the climate impacts. We've heard from a few women that we've interviewed in one part of Indonesia where CWS works. Their experiences were relatively positive. They found that they were able to earn income. They had migrated through a government administered migration scheme to Saudi Arabia, worked and came back, were able to earn income and put that back into their families' efforts to adapt to climate change. But they noted that their experience was dependent a lot on their employer, and we've been hearing this from other networks that are of migrants, and particularly of women who are in domestic work as migrants. But there's a real challenge that there's not a lot of visibility. You're working inside of someone's home. There's not a lot of public visibility. There's not a kind of workplace inspection system in place to ensure that your rights as an employee or your human rights just generally are being respected. And so there's been an effort that women in domestic work are taking up the lead on in many places to organize, to be able to provide mutual support, to be able to connect with churches, with other faith networks, and with NGOs to provide emergency support, legal support where women need it. And that can include to the point of trying to have, in the most extreme situations, either some sort of legal redress or even kind of first response to help a woman get out of a dangerous situation. So I think that's a very positive example in the sense that while the threats exist, that women are organizing and finding ways to provide support to people who are facing the extreme threats in some circumstances, and where you have more information, you have more power, and you can plan your time working outside of your community of origin in a way that helps you reinvest back in your family and in your community in ways that can support climate resilience. We've also, I think, been picking up that for men, also you can face risks, uncertainties in migration. And it may be that women who whose husbands are migrating are the ones who are taking on more economic responsibilities at home, including moving into sectors of the economy that are maybe traditionally male dominated. Mary mentioned this in relation to Kenya and beekeeping, that it's great that women have opportunities to take on new livelihoods. I think one of the things that our research is pointing us towards is that that needs to be connected with decision making and risk management from a household standpoint, from a family standpoint, so that if women are taking on the brunt of the responsibility of covering costs, if the return on investment of men migrating is uncertain, how can families acknowledge that, incorporate that into their planning, and how can women be equal partners in that planning at the family level to ensure that the opportunities don't also become burdens, and also to ensure protection for men who may be moving into risky situations and need support from their families as they're doing it.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I want to start with this question with you, Andrew. Rossum has mentioned several times that donors are not giving sufficient support to this entire area of gender equality, human rights, support for at-risk and vulnerable groups during the migration process and throughout the, we don't see these groups represented in climate risk management and climate planning. Can you say a little bit more about why, what the problem is and why this continues to be an important issue for us to lift up as agencies?
Thanks, Jasmine. I would say that as much as we're all working to support people in adapting in place and in becoming more climate resilient and addressing the kinds of root causes, particularly in relation to where migration is forced and it's not a choice or it's a constrained choice. The reality is that many people are on the move, partly in relation to climate change, often in relation to many other factors, including violence, including sort of the inequalities in accessing education, accessing other decent work opportunities. So that I think for us, as we speak up and speak out with decision makers, it's important to frame the question not as either or. There needs to be both more support to climate resilience and to climate adaptation, so people can have freedom and choice to thrive in places of origin. And there also needs to be more protection for people who are on the move and who are facing threats as they're moving, facing threats in places of destination. I think there's some body of evidence that simply providing more information about the risks of migration isn't necessarily going to impact somebody in their decision making, in part because the situations and the challenges that you're facing at home may be equally difficult, and that what we're, I think, looking into the research, we haven't gotten far enough to see what we've concluded, but one thing we're starting to pick up on from the interviews is that often the choice is not necessarily between staying and moving, but the choice between both and neither, and the both is in a sort of yes, limited options, that you have limited options to stay, and they cost money that you don't have. As governments are hardening borders, that's making both the financial cost and the real human cost of migrating very high, and that needs to be, I think, a very urgent reversal of policies that are increasing the threats that people are facing as they move. So that would be my message and my hope for those of you on the call who are going to be speaking with your congressional representatives or their staff members later, to bring forward that the U.S. needs to be doing doing more of both, that we do need to be working as a good partner in the climate adaptation space and supporting resilience that's being led by people who are most directly feeling the impacts of climate change. And at the same time, we need it not to be making it more threatening for people to move, especially when mobility, which is a human right, is something that people are using to move out of harm's way.
Thanks, Andrew. Mary, I want to come back to you. Are donors getting the message about your needs at community level in terms of, to address climate change?
Not much. I would say yes and no, because donors are getting message to respond to emergencies. We see a lot of reaction when there is an emergency, like in East Africa, from 2016, we have either been within a drought or a floods. And we have seen donor coming up and actually funding emergency response. We don't see much of funding going towards filling up that gap between emergency and sustainable development, and then continuing with sustainable development. The resources is quite limited. And for Kenya as a country, I think it's getting worse because Kenya became a mid-level income country. And for that reason, donors feel that a country in the middle income level should be able to take care of it. Most of it is basic needs. But with the continuous emergencies or disasters which are induced by climate change, there is need to pull these communities through emergency, then through durable solutions, and most likely looking into how they can adapt and mitigate on long term. Most donors are focusing on short term.
Yeah, that sounds unfortunately like the tendency. We need to open it up for questions from the audience, but Rostam, I know you have strong views on what the donors are doing and not doing. What are your comments on this? Briefly, please.
There is no agency today in Georgia except the ministry, the department of the Ministry of Internally Displaced Persons, or no other donors that are working with migrants in Georgia. I mean here, ecological migrants. While conducting this research, we couldn't fetch any examples of donors or local organizations working with ecological migrants, but although there are over 40,000 in Georgia that are settled in economically depressed areas, and they are in a worse situation than they have been before displacement. And these issues are not taken into consideration, and there is no clear regulatory or legal framework for ecological migrants. And I also want to reflect to what Andrew has said about the migration of man, but in the reality of Georgia, mostly women are that are migrating in search of jobs abroad. And they are the ones that supply the families with resources. But at first glance, it's okay. Women go to earn some money. But on the other hand, as a result, we have number of families and mostly children that are left without care. And Georgian men are not very good caretakers. And maybe today we see more and more street children living in the streets, children running from their communities. And this is becoming already a problem. You see, this is what I wanted just to reflect to what.
Thanks, Rostam. I think that's a very important detail. And we know that the number of unaccompanied minors also becoming, turning to migration as a survival strategy, that's also increasing all around the world. So thank you for adding that. I've been told that we have another 12 minutes. Do we have any questions from the audience? if you have any questions that you want to put to either Andrew, Rostam, or Mary, I invite you to unmute yourself and just speak directly to us. We're a smaller number now, so that's entirely possible. Any questions? No? Okay, hearing none. I think I want to not lose the chance to ask one final question. Mary, we talk a lot about climate justice and about climate injustice. Obviously, we mean by that the people who are most affected are not the ones who cause the problem. If you could have climate justice, what would it look like?
That's a great question. If East Africa would have climate justice, would mean that the countries that are creating most pollution fund our climate change mitigation and adaptation. For instance, in the continent, the issue of forest cover is a big issue. I think most countries are at less than 10% forest cover. And those ones are below the recommended percentage. And it's quite expensive to restore forest cover. And in the countries where we are having, of course, climate change, in the midst of growing populations. In Africa, populations are growing and they're growing rapidly. So forests will continue to be destroyed. So for that to happen, forest cover to be done, it means that we need lots and lots of money. Then we need money to develop technology and to develop industries so that people can get jobs, and they actually now focus more on like renewable energy and stop wasting the natural resources. So if we would have climate justice, then it means that the countries that are creating climate change would be funding activities that will restore climate change in Africa. That's what I would say.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. I love that. I love that version of climate justice. Rostam, what would climate justice look like for you?
Sorry. So thanks. We need, first of all, to include human rights as a transversal element, because human rights to housing, water, energy, clean air should be taken into consideration, and then it will be if we recognize this, the activities could be relevant, that everyone has the right to clean water, to energy, has the right to property, has the right to housing. It should be a transversal element. And also in the climate just development, we should ensure the effective participation of affected people, affected communities, and their voices should be heard. It's whether it's whatever the affected people it will be, whether women, elderly, youth, migrants, or whoever, but their voices should be heard. And the third issue that always comes to me is equal distribution of the funds and the resources, because the distribution of resources in the world is unequal. Though with a reasonable approach, this could be to some extent achieved. If not today, then tomorrow. And very important is to keep accountable those responsible for the climate crisis, and to identify who is responsible for the climate crisis. Me, an indigenous woman living in this village, remote village, or government, or big industry. This should be clear. So there are this done to some extent, but it should be clearly underlined who is more responsible for climate crisis. And the fifth, acknowledge social environmental, cultural, and human cost of the climate. Because in scientific literature and all over the world, you can see the calculations of a cost on the transmission to zero emission economy. But you never see the cost of social, environment, and cultural impacts. This is nowhere calculated, and this should be done together. This, then we will receive a whole picture, a climate justice. This is to my opinion. And
thank you,
colleague
Rostam.
that I'm working with.
Thank you, Rostam. Andrew, final word is with you. What would climate justice look like for you?
Yeah, that the costs and risks of responding to the crisis rest with those who have created it. And in thinking about mobility, that means not only investing in ways for people to be safe in home communities, but also to recognize that people are on the move because of climate change, and to stop making pathways riskier and instead make them safer.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have come to the end of our session. I know we just have a couple of people left with us. I want to open it up again to you. We have just a few minutes left. If you have any questions, now's your chance. But if not, I want to have say a huge thanks to Mary. I don't know what time it is in Mary, what time it is in Kenya for you, Mary, but I think it's quite late in the evening. And same for you, Rostam. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for your expertise, and the experience that you brought to this conversation, has been phenomenal. Really, really appreciated. It has been recorded and it is going to go out to and I think, in fact, it's going to go out to the participants of this event, but it's also going to be on the Ecumenical Advocacy Day's website, if I understand correctly. So really, really want to lift up what you said, and thank you so much. And to Andrew, yet again, hats off to you for pulling together what for a lot of people remains a very difficult to understand intersection between climate and migration. So very, very grateful to you again for your thoughts and reflections and encouragement as we go forward to Congress and we take those asks. So again, thank you to everybody on behalf of CWS in Washington, DC, working from home. Thanks to Diana, we would not have got here without you, as usual. And see you all next time.